the Western alliance has a combined gross domestic product of about $40 trillion. Russia's economy is 1.8 trillion. So we're 20 times the size of Russia. If we wanted to cripple Putin's economy, we could easily.
As an overview, how would you sum up the state of Russia's economy at the moment?
Yeah, well, the first thing to note is that Putin, the one person who knew this war was going to happen was Putin, right? So he's been preparing it for a very long time. I would say perhaps a decade. You can go back to the annexation of Crimea in 2014 when the West first imposed sanctions. He knew he was going to invade, right? And he built up Russia's reserves, I should say. He deleveraged the economy, made it less vulnerable to Western sanctions. Foreign exchange reserves at the onset of the war were about $640 billion. That's over 500 billion pounds, right? So he had all these reserves. So when he invaded, and he knew sanctions were going to come, there was a lot of durability there already, right? And obviously, initially he benefited from high energy and oil prices because also he created that, if you remember, just before the invasion, there was a lot of pressure on energy markets. People were worried about impact on energy supplies to Europe. So oil and energy prices increased. He benefited from that as well. It meant more revenues came in, so that helped him. So there's a lot of durability. Aggressive sanctions were imposed. Some of those resources have been eroded. Around $330 billion of that $640 billion I mentioned of foreign exchange reserves were immobilized in Western jurisdictions. So he's kind of halved his availability of foreign currency reserves. Sanctions have begun to bite. They've reduced those buffers, made Putin make difficult choices. Increased defense spending means less resources for elsewhere in the economy, less social spending, less spending on the economy. Russia's been converted to a war economy, right? And that, difficult choices have been made. Growth has been lower overall. I think actually not just since the invasion, but again, if you think of the last decade, the sanctions and the policies that Russia has put in place to alleviate the impact of sanctions have meant that Russia has grown a lot weaker, a lower pace of growth than it would otherwise have been the case. Inflation's been higher. So there's been some pain, but the economy hasn't crashed. And it hasn't crashed because he had those buffers in place. And I think in the end, sanctions have been too weak, right? I mean, that's the reality. And I think the reason they're too weak is because in the end, I think for sanctions to work, the countries imposing them have to be willing to bear some cost. And actually what's happened is with all these sanctions packages, it's been the sanctions by the highest common denominator. So basically some country within the Western alliance has always got an excuse of why their industry, their banking sector, their companies are going to get hurt. So let's not do them. So we've had lots of excuses and reasons to weaken and moderate the sanctions. And I think in the end, it shows that Western countries haven't really taken the threat from Putin seriously. If we saw this as a really big threat, a threat to our national security, we would do whatever it takes to beat Putin and beat Russia. And if we're unwilling to shoulder the burden, take some of the cost, it kind of shows really an unwillingness to take the whole thing seriously. If you think about it, a different way to look is the Western alliance has a combined gross domestic product of about $40 trillion. Russia's economy is 1.8 trillion. So we're 20 times the size of Russia. If we wanted to cripple Putin's economy, we could easily, but we haven't really been willing to do whatever it takes. And I think, you could say that's about the economy. You could say about defense spending. Lots of different areas. In the end, for far too long, we have just not taken the threat from Putin seriously, which is one reason why he was able to get away with invading Ukraine in the first place.
Are there other sanctions that the West could be implementing that would turn the screw on Putin?
Well, there's been a lot of focus on weak enforcement. Lots of countries not in the Western alliance, but around Russia, have been helping Russia get around the sanctions. There's something called secondary sanctions. So basically, where you identify countries that are trying to benefit from sanctions by allowing Russia to break them, you sanction them. You send a clear message that, you may not want to join our sanctions regime. You not want to be part of the Western alliance against Russia in this instance, but we don't want you to try and help Russia break the rules. So, countries in the Middle East, the Gulf, Turkey, Central Asia, we could be more aggressive in how we police sanctions to tighten the grip. There's a lot of what's called dual use goods that are getting into Russia, maybe consumer durable microchips, whatever, that you can use in a washing machine, but you can use in a tank. So we just need to be cleverer, more aggressive in terms of how we police them, tighten the screws on Russia. Because look, initially sanctions were imposed because of the annexation of Crimea and then Russia's Russia's invasion of Ukraine, full-scale invasion. I think it's pretty clear now that Russia is a long-term threat to us. Putin hates Western liberal market democracy. He hates the way we work, the way we're governed. He wants to destroy that. He's at war with us. He's made it clear that he's at war with us. That's been the messaging from him and Russian state TV. So we need to make sure that Russia cannot regenerate its military machine that's been destroyed in Ukraine. And so sanctions have to remain for a long time, a bit like North Korea. We need to weaken him longer term. So we need to be cleverer, more aggressive. We could do more within the existing sanctions regime. There is also a really interesting idea that's been put around by someone called Nigel Gould-Davis of a think tank, former ambassador to Belarus. He argues that, in the end, we need to send a really clear signal to Western business that you shouldn't really be doing any business with Russia, right? And he argues, and I actually agree with him, that we should set a date at some point in the future, maybe 3 or 5 years away, and we say Western business should move to zero trade with Russia. The default setting should be we shouldn't trade at all with Russia, aside from getting special licenses for things that are really critical, right? So I'm not saying we actually go to zero, but we concentrate businesses' minds, and they have to explain exactly why it's really important to buy a particular product from Russia or sell a particular product to Russia. I don't see why, for example, Western consumer companies should be selling yogurts. I mean, what's the benefit of that, right? Or beer. Why are we trading at all with this regime that is now a fascist regime that has invaded another countries, committing war crimes and actually genocide against Ukraine? I mean, this is all, the Putin regime is increasingly looking like Nazi Germany. Like, why are we doing this, right? So I think we need to be more innovative, think outside the box a bit. Putin does. Putin, he outmaneuvers us all the time by doing things illegally or, we play by the rules. If you play by the rules against Putin, we lose, right? So we need to just be a lot cleverer. The only solution is using frozen Russian assets. Make Russia pay for the war it's waging in Ukraine. And, I think it should be a political scandal, actually, that our governments are spending our money, our taxpayer money, is being used to fund the war in Ukraine and the reconstruction, while our governments are not willing to spend Russia's money sat in Western bank accounts. How is that possible? I just find it extraordinary. And you mentioned, William Hague has been supportive. David Cameron, one of the first things he did upon assuming the position of Foreign Secretary was to support this effort. The UK should be leading the charge within G7 to make sure this happened. I worry, actually, that UK Treasury, Hunt at the Treasury, they're finding excuses not to do it. And it has to be done. If this is not done, we don't fund Ukraine properly, we see macro instability and they lose the war. And as I said before, that means massively increased costs to all of us because of the threat from a resurgent Russia.
Longer term, hopefully once Ukraine has won this war, there will still be an enormous economic rebuilding job required for the country. What do you think is in store there? Do we need a Marshall Plan for the Ukrainian economy? Do we need to look at debt relief? What long term does Ukraine need?
Well, estimates of the damage, the World Bank and the Kiev School of Economics have done some work. At the moment, it's running around $500 billion, so $500 billion of damage. And it's every day gets bigger, right, as Russia inflicts more damage. So about $500 billion. Probably, it's very difficult to spend that in 1 year. I would imagine what is possible. Ukraine's about a $200 billion economy. It's feasible, probably, to spend about $50 billion on reconstruction. So that'll be over 10 years, something like that. So $50 billion a year over 10 years. If we see peace and Ukraine security is assured, I think Ukraine has a very good future. I think the 500 billion I mentioned, we can find from frozen Russian assets. Ukraine should be able to borrow in international capital markets. We can think of lots of different structures to help Ukraine fill that gap of $50 billion a year likely to the reconstruction recovery. And I think, the interesting thing is Ukraine now has the anchor of EU accession. One of the problems for Ukraine over the last 30 years, unlike Poland, the Baltic states, Hungary, Czech Republic, that have had remarkable and really successful recoveries from the communist period, was they were given the EU accession anchor. I mean, the thing about the EU accession story is, obviously Brexit, there were skeptics about the whole story, but actually EU accession provided a blueprint for reform for these countries. It was a checklist, what you needed to do, how you need to reform your judiciary, your regulatory environment, your banking systems, and countries just ticked the boxes, and it helped them, it simplified the process of reform, and it was successful. And a lot of international business, also when they thought that Poland or Czech Republic was going to join the European Union, they decided, well, these countries, they have cheap labor, good business environment. We want to invest. So a lot of money came in on the assumption that EU accession was going to happen. Ukraine never had that. The West never, or the European Union never gave it the green light to EU accession. It now has that. So I think that will help the reform process move forward. It will mean that international business will want to locate to Ukraine. And actually, one remarkable thing, and I've covered, I first went to Ukraine in 1987. I've covered the country as an economist for 30 years. The innovation I've seen from Ukraine has been remarkable. Think about drones. Their ability, Russia was a global superpower militarily with fourth, fifth generation military kit. Ukraine was like a third, fourth rate military power. And we could debate, why Ukraine hasn't won, how the counteroffensive failed, but to fight Russia to a standstill over 2 years, to stop the initial Russian invasion, was extraordinary. And it was successful because of this innovation that, Ukraine has a strong industrial base. They're clever people. They figured out, how to reprofile Western military kit to the best advantage. So I think that innovation that we've seen during the war will really help them in recovery. So when the war ends, if we assure Ukraine's security with the EU accession anchor, if we make sure we use frozen Russian assets to refinance the recovery, I think the Ukrainian economy will grow at a really good pace.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to the Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.